مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. شهد الشرق الأوسط انقلابات كثيرة في تاريخه الحديث، أما ثوراته الحقيقية فكانت قليلة. سواء حزنت أم فرحت، لا شك أن التغيير الذي حدث في إيران قبل 40 سنة كان ثورة. رحل النظام الملكي الموالي لأميركا، وحلت محله الجمهورية الإسلامية، وهي شكل جديد من حكومة يتولى فيه القادة الدينيون أنفسهم السلطة السياسية. تغير كل شيء، بداية من المجتمع والثقافة والدين، وصولا إلى دور إيران في العالم. من بين الثوابت خلال تلك السنوات 40 كان الصراع بين إيران والشيطان الأكبر أمريكا، والآن إدارة ترامب تزيد الضغط على طهران. فما هو مستقبل الجمهورية الإسلامية؟ لمناقشة ماضي إيران وحاضرها ومستقبلها، وكذلك دورها في السياسة الخارجية الأميركية، يسرني أن أرحب باللجنة التي تضم خبيرين إيلان بيرمان وبنم بن طلبو. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. It's 40 years since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, an event that overthrew not just the Shah of Iran, but toppled American strategy in the broader Middle East. 40 years later, Iran is still at the top of our regional strategic agenda. And I'm delighted to welcome Ilan Berman wa Behnam Ben Taleblu to discuss U.S. policy toward Iran and the challenge Iran faces from America today. So, 40 years into the Islamic Republic, gentlemen, how serious and urgent is the threat that Iran poses to the United States and American interests in the region?
Well, there's a lot of people in Washington who will frame the Iran threat as a 2 out of 10, and then there's another group of people who will frame it out of 12 out of 10. But the area where Iran is really growing in terms of the missiles, military, terrorism, the regional threat, that's the threat we knew of the Islamic Revolution ever since it came about, and that's the threat that's been maturing, a 6, 7, 8. And Iran is making strategic investments in those portfolios that give it a very, very high return on investment. So Iran could spend about $1 million on a ballistic missile, force Israel to spend about $16 billion on missile defense. So Iran is a rising power. It certainly is not a great power in the Middle East, but it's definitely a rising power. And it was really birthed to challenge U.S. security, U.S. interests, and the interests of our partners.
So a rising power, you give it a 6, 7, 8 on the scale of 10. Ilan?
No, I tend to agree. The real, I think, important thing to notice from the American policymaker perspective is that in Washington, when we look at Iran, when we look at what Iran is doing regionally, we see both growing capability and growing ambition. And those two things married together is what has created the urgency for the Trump administration. On the one hand, you see serious Iranian investments in military modernization, in their ballistic missile arsenal, in cyber capabilities. And on the other hand, you see Iran, which has over the last couple of years exploited this permissive regional environment that was created by the 2015 nuclear deal to expand beyond its borders, to expand its influence in places like Iraq, in places like Syria. And so the Trump administration is very concerned by both aspects of the threat, both by Iran's ability to reach out and touch America and its regional allies, but also by an emboldened Iran, which is increasingly moving aggressively throughout the region.
So if you're trying to prioritize what you think Iran's ambitions are, what you think it's, how it poses a threat to you and your allies, what's at the top of the list? Is it stability in Arab states? Is it Israel? Is it missiles hitting the west coast of the United States? What would you say, Ilan?
Well, I think it's a good question, and I think it's possible to talk about all these different things. I'm not of the school that thinks that Iran is fixated on Israel to the exclusion of other priorities. But what Iran is doing regionally, particularly in places like Syria, I think projects an image of a country that increasingly sees itself as an incipient empire and is beginning to act that way. So to me, the biggest threat posed by Iran is actually the threat posed by what Iran has managed to do in Syria over the last 3 years. The countervailing force of Shiite irregulars drawn from Afghanistan, from Yemen, from Iraq, from Pakistan, that Iran has marshaled to fight, first and foremost, in the service of the Assad regime against the Islamic State and other opponents of Assad, but which, now that that conflict is coming to a close, may be harnessed and weaponized by Iran to go elsewhere.
Would you agree, as Syria and what Iran is trying to do is being the arena of first priority?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Elon there. I think the regional threat is the preeminent threat. It's the threat that we all knew when there was the Islamic Revolution 40 years ago. Khomeini talked about a revolution without borders. There's very little in Iran today. If you look at the institutions that are actually called Iranian by design, they are called Islamic. They're supposed to be ecumenical, pan-Islamic across the region. The Iranian model is a model designed for export. Those militias and proxies that Elon was talking about are not part of the formal Iranian army. They're not even fully affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They're irregulars that will constitute this Shiite Foreign Legion, different ethnic groups that Iran can deploy to different hotspots. And the reason that's a threat is not because your Afghan irregular fighter can outfight a U.S. Marine. It's because we simply don't have the policy tools here in the United States to actually contest Iran's ability to insert irregulars at a much earlier stage of conflicts into these theaters. It's much costlier for us. You know, we have a much higher threshold for the use of force, and we are quite content to use tools like sanctions. But you know, for Iran's revolutionaries, it's not always going to be about the bottom dollar.
So you raise an interesting question about the tools that America has to confront the various range of threats from Iran. Recently, the United States organized a major international event in Warsaw, brought together many of our Middle Eastern and allies throughout Europe and elsewhere. Iran wasn't in the title of the event, but it was the subtext of this event. What are we trying to achieve, and how does these sort of public events achieve that goal?
I think the Trump administration needs to take its successful economic strategy, its creating of leverage against Iran, which has really been unprecedented in the past 6 to 9 months, the restoration of sanctions waived by the deal, the issuance of new designations or new penalties on entities affiliated with Iran or supportive of its cyber missile military programs. And grow that. And it needs to turn that economic leverage into political leverage. And to do that, you need a broad coalition. You need to have your preeminent allies across Europe not contest you and not contest the narrative of the threat that Iran poses. Moreover, you want to get them to marry their rhetoric with reality. For 6 years, European officials have been talking about the Iranian missile program, but it's been more than half a decade since a single Iranian entity has been sanctioned under missile authorities by the EU. December 2012 was the last time.
So Benham is saying that the United States needs to build on its economic pressure for real political leverage. Have we accomplished that with what we organized in Warsaw?
So I think the answer is yes and no. I think it's a little bit too early to tell. But it's very clear from the way the Trump administration approached the Warsaw Conference that it was trying to both apply pressure and provide incentives at the same time. On the one hand, all the principles that came from the United States were very interested in corralling European officials to fall into line behind this economic policy, to strengthen, to amplify the impact that the reinvigorated sanctions regime against Iran has on the Islamic Republic. On the other hand, though, and you see this, I think very clearly from the comments made by Vice President Pence, there is a sense on the part of the Trump administration that there are countries, particularly countries in Europe, that are working at cross purposes with the United States, that are undermining what the Trump administration is trying to do in trying to contain and isolate Iran by continuing to do business. And I think this sets up a second line of inquiry, which will follow over the next several weeks, which is that the Trump administration is beginning to be angry, be irritated, be aggravated by the failure to create a common language to deal with Iran. And how that plays out in America's relations with Europe and with potential allies in Europe on this front, I think remains to be seen.
And since you spoke earlier about Syria as being the principal target, what impact does America's decision to withdraw its military forces from Syria have on the broader effort to build this coalition against Iran?
Right. No, I think that's a great question. And really, I think for regional officials that are looking askance at Washington now in the aftermath of that decision, the real question is America done? Have we
done?
Are we turning our attention away from the Middle East? Are we turning our attention to Russia, to China, to great power competition? And that sort of duality is something that the Trump administration, I think, inadvertently has really conveyed. And so the principal job of the Trump administration, both at the recent Warsaw conference, but certainly in the weeks ahead, is to convince regional officials that America is still committed, that Iran policy is still continuing and it's going to be as robust as it was before, and that they need to fall in line because America is not leaving.
And what do you think it will take to convince our partners? If we're pulling out from northeastern Syria, are there other tools that we can use to transmit this message of commitment and determination?
Well, it's going to take more than rhetoric. That's absolutely clear. I think rhetoric is an important predicate. I think the Trump administration rightly changed the narrative about Iran and the Middle East when it came into office, restored the sanctions. But the question is now what? I think when you look at our allies in the Gulf, for instance, we need to really step up the efforts to integrate their American-provided ballistic missile defense systems. The U.S. desperately needs an Iraq policy that's about creating a strong, stable, sovereign Iraq. It's not just because we're interested in having Iraq renegotiate Kirkuk or any other kind of oil field. An Iraq that is able to reject this kind of Iranian slow encroachment on the state is both in Iraq's national interest and in America's national interest. And really, when it comes to military posture in the region, we need things that are not necessarily ornamental. The most important thing that the U.S. had done against Iran in Syria was the maintenance of the base in Tanf, where it trained Syrian rebels. But it looks like we'll be withdrawing 200 American special forces, but may or may not be keeping that base open. We don't have the legal predicate to keep that base open or to commence some kind of pushback on Iran militarily. The U.S. needs to square all of these kind of intellectual circles to create a new policy against Iran. And that will be a heavy lift given the partisan environment here and that fact that some Arab states are already seeking to restore ties with Assad because they see America retreating. Syria has been home to bipartisan foreign policy failures.
Okay, with that, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to look at the domestic side of the Iranian challenge and whether there's opportunities that the United States may be able to exploit in just a moment. Our guests today include Behnam Ben Taleblu. Behnam closely tracks Iranian national security and domestic politics as a senior fellow for the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, an influential Washington think tank. His analysis has appeared in such prestige publications as the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Policy. Sitting to his left is Ilan Berman. Ilan is Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council, a major voice on foreign policy making here in Washington. An expert on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Russia, he is a frequent media commentator and the editor of 4 books. He's also consulted for both the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. Department of Defense. So, gentlemen, let's take a look at the internal scene in Iran. The economy is in shambles. The revolutionary spirit has slipped away. Is Iran still the same place it was when Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah 40 years ago? Ilan?
So I think this is really the central question. And it's certainly the central question that's preoccupying regime officials in Tehran. And that's why in the run-up to the 40th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, of Khomeini's 79 revolution, you saw a lot of rhetoric, of official rhetoric coming out of Tehran about the successes of the revolution. You had Ayatollahs who were talking about how Iran has made 400 years of progress just in the last 4 decades. Of course, empirically, the data suggests something very different. In real terms, according to the World Bank, ordinary Iranians are a third poorer than they were in 1979. Purchasing power has declined. The Iranian national currency has cratered. A lot of that is external as a result of pressure from the United States and this reinvigorated sanctions policy, but not all of it. And there is, I think, a very significant strain, and one that should be amplified by Western audiences about regime mismanagement, about the prioritization of ideology over prosperity, and about how the Islamic Republic has consistently preferred to spend money on foreign adventurism and not on grassroots prosperity. And all of these things are coming to a head in the types of protests that you've seen, which have been going on in Iran for over a year now, even though they're not capturing much media attention.
So do you think Iran is about to crack open?
You know, I think in many ways the revolution has failed its promises within the first decade. You know, the revolution was brought about by a wide array, a diverse coalition, leftists, communists, nationalists, Marxists, Islamists, and all of a sudden, Khomeini and his Islamist clique began to make sure the domestic space contracted. And what we've seen for the past 40 years is that there's been a graying of the acceptable boundaries of what is possible in Iran, what is possible under Khomeini's Iran. And ever since then, the regime has been cracking, but it hasn't been cracking at the pace some inside Iran as well as some outside would like it to. Regime officials understand that there is a growing chasm between state and society, between the center and the periphery, and that Iran has failed those whom it promised the fruit of the revolution, the downtrodden.
But failure of the revolution doesn't necessarily mean the revolution or the government, the regime goes away.
Exactly.
What would it take for that to happen? And do you think it'll be peaceful or violent?
You know, I'm a pessimist by nature, mostly because I focus on Iran.
Usually you don't get people saying that on air.
Honesty is the best policy. But one key force to look at is actually not the street protests, because I think the history of that country tells you 94, 99, 2009, 2017, 18, those protests are slated to continue because none of those grievances have ever been met. The key force to look at are the security forces. What really led the Shah's forces to fall is that the conscripts sided with the revolutionaries. So security force cohesion and looking at what element of Iran's security forces they choose to put in front of protesters, and if they fire, that will determine if the regime actually collapses.
So what do you think, Ilan? Peaceful, violent, imminent or not?
No surprise, I tend to agree. My sense is that there's a couple of core problems. So certainly the problem that Behnam talked about, the security forces and cohesion is the central one, right? And we've seen again and again throughout the Middle East, particularly over the last decade, in places where the security forces stand firm and they don't fragment, the regime stands. In places where they crack, the regime falls, or falters at least. And so I think that's a core point. And to that point, I think the administration in Washington would be very well served to figure out how to put greater pressure on precisely this node of Iranian society. We've spent a lot of time talking about official corruption. We spent a lot of time talking about Iranian adventurism. We haven't spent as much time as we should talking about whether it's possible and how to, if it is, fragment public opinion among the people who bear arms within the Islamic Republic. The second trend, which I think is interesting, is that this movement is still inchoate. It's still incoherent. It knows what it's against. And the protesters that you've seen over the last year are very much against the failed economic policies of the regime. They're repudiating the regime ideology, but they don't yet know what they're for. There isn't really a positive agenda, a vision of a post-theocratic Iran that has emerged out of these protests. And so this is a protest movement, but it's not really a revolutionary movement, at least not yet.
So let me ask you gentlemen, when you look at U.S. policy, do we have the right balance between stopping Iran's or preventing or countering Iran's regional ambitions versus taking advantage of these cleavages domestically? Are there things that we should be doing to rebalance this U.S. approach? Should we be actively trying to bring about change in the Islamic Republic?
So the answer is no, no, yes, if I'm getting the questions right. Look, I think in many ways, what the administration is focusing on, the nuts and bolts of Iran's economic interactions with the Europeans, with countries in Asia, is the easy part. It's the easy part because it's external, and we have mechanisms of leverage. What's happening within Iran is, I think, a much harder thing for the United States to address. There is this tension within the administration about whether or not America really should invest in a full-throated support of an overthrow of the Islamic Republic. I think the verdict on this is, I think, still very much out.
Thank you for joining us in Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Women bring very unique qualities. We have the ability to work as a team. We have the ability to include others and multitask. And we have an amazing ability as women to see the entire field as opposed to just being narrowly focused. And so I would say to the women in the Middle East to believe in yourself, number one, have the courage and the boldness to reach for the stars, because women were created for greatness. We just need the opportunity to show our full potential.
The year 1979 was one of the most pivotal years in world history, and one of the most influential in my own life. I remember it vividly. It was a year that began with my last few months in high school, a time of great fun and excitement, and ended with my first semester of college, a time of anxiety and adventure. I don't remember a lot about high school or college, but that year I remember like it was yesterday. That is certainly true of the seismic events in the Middle East that occurred that year. It was a year that opened with the overthrow of the Shah's regime and the coming to power of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Death to America, represented by the takeover of the American embassy and the taking of American hostages, was daily fare on national television. Just weeks after Ayatollah Khomeini took power in Tehran, a piece of really good news happened elsewhere in the Middle East: the signing of the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. That hopeful moment was a sharp counterpoint to the dark curtain that fell across Iran. The year continued. In November 1979, Sunni extremists took over the Great Mosque in Mecca, the first blow in a jihadist campaign still being waged against status quo powers across the Middle East. And in December 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, making a play for power in the broader region that ultimately failed, but which set in motion changes that are still reverberating throughout the area today. The events of '79 are still with us. On the plus side, Arabs and Israelis may not have solved all their problems, including the important issue of Palestine, but they have learned to manage them. That's especially important since they have come to face other problems that became more urgent: the threat of Sunni extremism and the danger of Iranian expansionism, ambition, and subversion. And after a timeout from history, the Russians are back, more deeply active in the heart of the Middle East than at any time in memory. After a moment when one administration extended an outreached hand to Iran, another administration is displaying the clenched fist. Perhaps it is correct to focus its energies on isolating and weakening the regime in Iran, which may have deeper vulnerabilities today than at any point in its history. It is certainly correct to build on the common interests of our allies, to build a community of shared concern in collective action on Iran. But if the past 40 years have taught us anything, it is that hope and aspiration are not themselves a policy. Success will require an all-of-government effort to achieve results. After all, for the mullahs in Iran, this is about existence and survival. If, for America, it is just another policy among a broad range of policies, some that are more resourced than others, some that have broader support in the administration than others, some that have wider public appeal than others, then I fear we will look back a decade from now on how the Islamic Republic made it to the half-century mark. My own preference is for the Islamic Republic by then to be a chapter in a Middle East history book, not a news item on the front page of newspapers. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الصراع الممتد على المدى 40 سنة بين الجمهورية الإسلامية والولايات المتحدة، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.